The sound of crunching gravel at full throttle snapped me out of my quiet morning. My coffee sloshed in the cup as I turned my head, just in time to see the front end of Karen's bright red ATV fly into the air. She'd hit the new wooden wall I built across the trail, square on, launched herself over the handlebars, and landed flat on her back in a puff of dirt and shame. Her plastic sun visor went flying in one direction, her phone in another, and from the ground she started shrieking like a banshee in broad daylight. "You tried to kill me," she yelled, arms flailing, while her little yappy dog barked from the passenger crate mounted on the back of the overturned vehicle. I didn't say a word. I just took a slow sip of my coffee and pointed to the big sign on the wall that read "Private Property No Access." It was the third time she'd trespassed this week, and she had the audacity to act like I was the criminal. This wasn't just about a shortcut anymore. This was war. Karen had been using the path that ran behind my property as her personal ATV freeway ever since I moved in 6 months ago. At first I thought maybe it was a one-time thing. Then it became a daily routine. The engine would start up at dawn, and I'd hear her rip through the back acreage like she was training for some kind of suburban motocross competition. One day I walked out to confront her, but she just waved like we were neighbors in a sitcom and kept right on driving. The worst part was she never once asked permission. She just assumed the land was hers to use. When I finally stopped her and mentioned it was private property, she laughed and said, "Oh please, everyone uses that path, it's basically public access." But I checked the deed. There were no easements, no shared right-of-way. That trail was 100% mine. Still she kept coming. I tried everything short of confrontation. I put up no trespassing signs. She said the wind must have blown them down. I put up reflectors. She called them an eyesore and threatened to report me to the HOA. That's when I learned she was not just any neighbor, she was the self-declared head of HOA enforcement. It wasn't a real position. No one voted for her. But she had a badge she made herself and wielded it like she was some kind of suburban sheriff. She started sending passive-aggressive notices for things like visible tools near my barn or my mailbox being half an inch too short. It was all intimidation tactics because I wouldn't let her use the shortcut. So I decided it was time to make a statement. I spent the weekend building a solid wooden wall across the trail complete with concrete anchors and cedar beams. It wasn't just for show. I wanted something sturdy enough to stop a determined Karen. I installed 2 game cameras, one high and one low, so there would be no dispute if she came through again. And just to make it clear, I added a painted wooden sign that read "End of the Road for Shortcut Queens." It was snarky, sure, but after months of her nonsense I felt it was more than justified. The morning she crashed into it was the first moment of peace I'd had in weeks. But of course it didn't last. She limped over to my porch and started banging on the door with one high-heeled gardening clog, screaming about lawsuits and medical emergencies. "You can't build a death trap in the middle of a trail," she shrieked. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." I calmly reminded her the trail was mine and she was trespassing. That only made her angrier. She threatened to call the police. I told her to go right ahead. Then I showed her the camera footage of her crossing into my land and the video of her ignoring the signs days earlier. Her face turned the same color as her ATV. She muttered something about HOA bylaws and stormed off back to her yard, dragging her busted ATV behind her with her dog nipping at her heels. I figured maybe that would be the end of it. A normal person might feel a little shame. Maybe even apologize. But not Karen. That night I noticed motion lights flashing in the direction of the wall. I walked out and saw her in her backyard with binoculars pointed directly at it. She had a notepad in one hand and her phone in the other. She was documenting it like she was building a legal case. The next day I received a letter slipped under my door. An official-looking HOA notice claiming I had created an unauthorized barrier that violated community standard. It was signed Enforcement Liaison Karen. No last name. Just Karen. I drove straight to the county office the following morning and confirmed once again that my land was not under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, it had been formally exempt for years because it used to be an agricultural lot before the neighborhood expanded. The clerk even gave me a copy of the original waiver with a stamp. I smiled the whole way home. Karen had no legal leg to stand on, but she was about to trip over her own nonsense anyway. That evening she returned with backup, 2 of her friends from the HOA board. All 3 marched up to the wall and started taking pictures like it was a crime scene. One of them even brought a measuring tape. I leaned on my porch post watching them as they huddled together, whispering like kids planning mischief behind the school gym. Then they left in a huff. I thought maybe they'd finally accepted defeat. But I was wrong. So very wrong. Later that night I reviewed the game camera footage, just to make sure everything was recorded. And that's when I saw something that made me pause. One of Karen's friends had glanced up at the camera, then quietly reached into her bag and pulled out a can of spray paint. She didn't use it then, but she had it ready. I knew in that moment they weren't done. They were planning something. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. And I had just built the battleground. 2 days after Karen's infamous ATV crash, the neighborhood began to buzz with whispers. People walking their dogs slowed down near my property. Some nodded with what felt like approval. Others looked away awkwardly, clearly torn between HOA loyalty and pure entertainment. But Karen wasn't sulking in silence. No, she was rallying. Flyers started showing up on everyone's mailboxes with bold red letters reading "Emergency HOA Meeting." The topic was deliberately vague, something about community safety and obstructive structures, but I already knew what it was about. She was coming for the wall. She was coming for me. I wasn't technically on the HOA's list anymore, but my property was still close enough to be considered adjacent, and that gave me the right to attend the meeting as a concerned neighbor. I showed up 5 minutes early and sat in the back of the clubhouse with a bottle of water and a GoPro hidden in my shirt pocket. The room was filled with a small crowd of people in folding chairs, sipping lemonade and pretending this wasn't just a poorly veiled witch hunt. Karen stood at the front, arms crossed, tapping her notes with theatrical annoyance. She wore a pearl necklace and a pastel cardigan like she was running for office, but her eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside her. As soon as the meeting started, Karen launched into what she called a presentation but was really just a rant. She pulled out a large printed photo of her overturned ATV next to my wall and held it up like it was evidence from a war crime. This dangerous and unapproved barrier has been placed directly across a historic community access route. She used words like historic and community like they had legal weight, but anyone who'd lived here longer than a decade knew the trail behind my barn was just a leftover tractor path from the 80s. She twisted the story like a pro, though, implying that dozens of neighbors used the path daily for peaceful recreation. I looked around the room. Not a single person nodded in agreement. Most avoided eye contact. Then came the threats. Karen waved a stack of fake violation slips like they were court subpoenas. She announced that I had been fined $12,000 for multiple HOA violations: visual obstruction, landscape nonconformity, safety hazards, unauthorized structures. It was a storm of nonsense stacked so high I was almost impressed. But I didn't flinch. When she finally opened the floor for discussion, I stood up slowly and thanked her for the entertaining slideshow. Then I calmly informed the room that my land was not under HOA jurisdiction. I pulled out the stamped exemption papers I got from the county and handed copies to everyone in the front row. Karen tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand and kept speaking. I told them about the cameras, the signs, the harassment, and most importantly, the lack of any legal right for Karen to be using or claiming the trail as public. The room shifted. People sat straighter. A few nodded. One woman near the front even whispered finally. Karen's face went pale. Her mouth opened but no words came out. It was clear she hadn't expected resistance this well prepared. But then she pivoted. She said I might be exempt from the HOA technically, but I was still part of the community and should respect the norms. That's when I dropped the final bomb. I told them I had legal representation, and if any more false notices showed up at my property, my attorney would be involving county officials for harassment and abuse of power. Karen looked like she swallowed a lemon whole. The room stayed silent. I walked out before she could recover. The next day, just as I thought the dust might settle, I found my wall tagged with bright pink spray paint. The words "land thief" stretched across the boards like a toddler's tantrum in cursive. I reviewed the camera footage immediately. There she was, Karen's teenage daughter, wearing a hoodie and giggling with another girl while holding a can. They ran off into the woods after tagging it, laughing like they'd just pulled off the prank of the century. I could have gone to the police right then. But I had a better idea. I called my cousin Alan, who happened to be a civil rights attorney with a specialty in property law. He lived a few counties over and had been itching for a reason to come visit the farm. When I explained the situation and sent him the footage, he laughed for 5 straight minutes. He said this was exactly the kind of petty HOA tyranny he loved to dismantle. He showed up the next day with a stack of letters, a calm smile, and a digital folder ready to drop on anyone who dared push the boundary again. We walked together to the next HOA meeting. Karen was already mid-speech, scolding a neighbor about wind chimes. Alan waited until there was a lull, then stepped forward and introduced himself. He handed her an envelope with a cease and desist notice and informed her that if she or any member of the HOA contacted me again or stepped onto my property without consent, legal action would follow immediately. Karen tried to bluster, but he shut it down fast. He read aloud the exact section of the state code that made her fake fines invalid and made it crystal clear that I was under no obligation to entertain her invented authority. The silence in the room was brutal. Karen looked like a statue with a bad Wi-Fi signal. Then Alan handed a copy of the footage of her daughter vandalizing the wall to the board's secretary and said if we wanted to press charges, we could. Karen's tone changed overnight. She stopped barking at neighbors. Her ATV disappeared from the trail. But she wasn't done. That weekend, I caught a strange glare coming from my field at 2 a.m. I checked the drone cam and there she was again, this time creeping along the side of the wall with a flashlight. She didn't touch anything, just stared. Maybe hoping the wall would vanish in the dark. Maybe waiting for a moment to reclaim her imaginary shortcut. But the camera caught it all. The war was far from over. She was brewing something bigger. And now it wasn't just about her ATV. It was about power. And she was about to find out how powerless she really was. It started with a strange humming sound at midnight. At first, I thought it might just be the wind pushing against the wooden beams of the wall. But as I stepped out onto my porch with a flashlight, the noise got louder, mechanical, deliberate. I aimed the light across the field and saw shadows moving near the trail. Figures in dark clothes hunched low, creeping around the base of my wall. I immediately grabbed my phone and activated the drone cam feed. The live footage lit up with infrared tracking, and there they were, 5 people, one with bolt cutters, another with what looked like a crowbar, and 2 more standing guard while Karen herself pointed toward the beams like she was conducting a covert military op. She had returned, not with a legal case, not with logic, but with a mini demolition crew at 1 a.m. I hit record and let the drone quietly hover over the scene, its quiet rotors masked by the rustling trees. They started working on the far end of the wall, targeting the section that wasn't reinforced with concrete. The woman with the crowbar jammed it under one of the posts and began prying while Karen gave orders in a whisper shout. They weren't just removing the wall, they were trying to erase it. I couldn't believe it. After cease and desist letters, legal warnings, and police threats, she had resorted to straight-up sabotage. But I was ready. Before she made her move that night, I had already tipped off a local deputy about the possibility of property vandalism. I'd shown him the footage of the wall being tagged, the flyers, the HOA notices, and Karen's rants. The deputy, a man named Cruz, had laughed and said it was one of the weirdest HOA disputes he'd seen, but he promised to swing by occasionally. I sent him the drone footage live as the attack unfolded. He texted back one word: on my way. Down by the wall, Karen's crew was making progress. They managed to tear down one of the crossbeams and started stacking it to the side, as if hiding the evidence would change the fact that they were caught red-handed. I kept watching, barely breathing, until red and blue lights suddenly splashed across the trees like a disco gone wrong. Karen's head whipped around so fast it looked like it might spin off. The sound of a car door slamming was followed by a commanding voice echoing through a loudspeaker.